Hi everyone, welcome to week 10 of Introduction to Communications, and this week we are going to be talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. Very interesting and also quite a topic in Australia and for Australians who are not Indigenous. It's quite a sensitive topic. So let's get right into it. Last week we talked about misunderstandings, cultural barriers and social barriers. So hopefully you've gone through that video and actually I think I've gotten to make myself small. I did, but I'm not going to start again. That happens. Okay, here we go. Kind of starting again. Okay, so this is last week we talked about misunderstandings. Hopefully you've watched that lecture and have a good comprehension of the various barriers and the various reasons why misunderstandings can occur in communication. So week 10, today's lecture is mainly around communicating with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And there you see an image. And I don't know how much you know about this cohort in Australia. I wish that I could say that it was a more visible group. In this way, the way that they are dressed in traditional dress and doing their corroboree, I assume, or a dance or whatever it is. But it's not. It's quite hidden in Australia, and you'll come to kind of understand, if you don't already know, the issues surrounding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also the legacy that was left by the colonials when they first came here. So Indigenous people, a bit of a history lesson first of all. We have here that the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues estimates there are more than 370 million Indigenous people spread across 70 countries worldwide, and each have their own traditions and their own culture, and retain their social, cultural and economic and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. And so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are no different. They are the original inhabitants of Australia and probably the oldest known people in the world. So how fortunate is Australia to have that link with the past. So Australia's Indigenous peoples are two distinct cultural groups made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so that's something that not many people, in our culture here in Australia know or understand. And that comes from the idea very early on that they were all one group of people. They were all one cohort of people kind of spread across the country. And yes, they do come from, in a broader sense, Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, but they are actually different communities of people, and they don't see themselves as being kind of from this one mass group. And we'll talk about that shortly, but I can assure you that not very many people in this culture know that. And it would go on to say there is great diversity within these two broadly described groups, exemplified by the over 250 different language groups spread across the nation. And so that gives you an idea of how many different, actual groups there are of Indigenous Australians. So an accepted definition of an Indigenous Australian proposed by the Commonwealth Department of Aboriginal Affairs in the 1980s and still used by some Australian government departments today is a person of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent who identifies as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander and is accepted as such by the community in which he or she lives. So really pay attention to those words. And is accepted by the community in which he or she lives. Now, what they're trying to say is that people can claim to be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and yet if they are not recognised and accepted within a community of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, then they are not considered to be so. And so we'll get on to that, but that's one of the ways, one of the legal tests right here on this slide. There are 3 legal tests that determine whether a person is Indigenous. And the reason that you need to know this is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander as a group receive very different and receive special consideration in terms of, education and social support by the government. And so people who have that Indigenous background or that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, once they tick, yes, I am of this, of this race, then they are entitled to receive many entitlements, which is fantastic because they do need that in the community. But the government has set up a stringent kind of test for ensuring that others are not taking advantage, I guess, of these special considerations. So they must be of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, number 1. They must identify as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, number 2. And this is the clincher really, they must be recognised as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander by other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. So skin colour has nothing to do with defining whether a person is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So what you're going to find is that there are people who identify as that group and yet don't have that skin colour. So we definitely don't look to skin colour, but we do look to identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but also being recognised as that group. And so what happens with saying that you're an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander is that you have to then say what kin you have who live in Australia who would recognise you as a part of their culture. So it's not enough to say that you belong to their culture. People have to also recognise you and say, yes, in fact, that's right, if it were me, Renee is a part of our group. So it's not enough for me to say, yes, I am part of their group. Then I need them to also recognise me. And so, I guess depending on how you look at it, that could either be a really difficult thing to establish, or it could be, a very necessary and important thing to establish, because otherwise, people may be taking advantage of the support. So what term do you use? There are many terms for Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal, Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. There's just some of the words that people use. And we have here that the term Indigenous Australian is used to encompass both Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. However, and this is important, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do not like to be referred to as Indigenous, as the term is considered to be too generic. So did you know that when the colonials arrived here and looked around and said, wow, look at all the flora and fauna, so look at all the different plants, look at all the different animals and so forth, that the Aboriginal people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, were included in amongst, the concept of flora and fauna. And therefore, when they're referred to as Indigenous, that term is actually encompassing flora, fauna and people. And so it makes sense that we find a word to describe specifically the people of Australia, rather than lump them in with, the vegetation and the animals that were around. So it is best to find out what the individual that you're working with prefers to be called, rather than making an assumption. And I think that you would know by now that being very conscious of making sure that your client is able to, to define themselves with you. I am, and then, this is what I am, and then you refer to them as that way, and you can only find out through asking. Other titles that we need to also consider. Aboriginal people may refer to themselves as titles relevant to the greater region that they are connected to. So did you know this? That some Aboriginal people refer themselves in relation to the Koori, the Māori, and the Noongar, and they are examples of this. So all over Australia, Aboriginal descendants, the descendants of maybe town people are still living there in these areas, and they still refer to themselves as coming from that area, and not just coming from, but as those peoples. So, that might be something new for you, but, it just basically refers to just the place that they're from. Aboriginal identities can also directly link to their language groups and traditional country. So Yawuru people and the traditional custodians are the traditional custodians of Broome in Western Australia, and the Gunditjmara people are the traditional custodians of Western Victoria. And I think it would be a very interesting, I guess, little exercise for you to do, is to find out the different areas and find out what peoples, originally come from that area. And there will be signs around the place, you may have noticed them, that tell you what the people were of the particular area that you're in. So I know that's certainly about where I live. Torres Strait Islander people prefer to use the name of their home island to identify themselves. So a Sabai man or woman is from Sabai, or a Merian person is from Mer. I hope I am getting the pronunciation right. So the history, the lives of Indigenous Australians today are affected by what has happened to us and our ancestors over the past 230 years since Europeans arrived. And that's a really important statement, and I would like you to remember that statement every time you are working with, as a community services worker, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Know that the person that you're speaking with is affected still, possibly, by what happened to them and their ancestors. There is a great deal of mistrust. There is a great deal of probably fear, I would say, and trepidation. It has not been a successful story since the Europeans arrived, and it's not talked about a lot. It is not well known, and it should be, in my personal opinion. But here is an opportunity for you to learn a bit about it. So the negative impacts of racial and economic disadvantage and a series of past government policies, including segregation, displacement and separation of families, has contributed to the mistrust held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people towards government services and systems. And so you've got little images there of children, and you've got images there of parents, but they're not with their original parents. So I guess that they are photos of separation of families, and we'll get on to that. But certainly there were many policies enacted because of the Aboriginal problem, I suppose, back when it all began. They looked at this land when they arrived here, the Europeans I'm talking about, and they said, there's no one here. It's I'm thinking of Tabula Rasa, but it's not Tabula Rasa. It's it's a land with nobody in it. Let's conquer it, invade it, take over it. Okay, that's pretty much what was said. And yet there were people here. It is not a land in which there was nobody already here. They were just pretty much ignored. And so they became, the problem. What are we going to do with them? Pretty much. So the colonials came over, took over, and decided, hey, you know what, let's do something about them. So there was a lot of killing, and then there was a lot of destruction of Aboriginal places and Aboriginal customs and Aboriginal people. They were destroyed. There's no really other word to say it. Terra nullius. Oh, it's just come into my head. The terra nullius is a Latin term which means, the earth that has nothing on it. So there's nothing on it. And so that's what Australia was considered to be, a terra nullius. There's nothing on here, we can invade it. Sorry about that. Slow brain. At Federation in 1901, the rights of citizenship were not extended to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Can you imagine? The people coming over here and deciding there's no one here, and then being forced to recognise that yes, there were people here, and not only that, they deserve the right of being recognised by the new inhabitants. They couldn't do that. It was obviously something that they couldn't bring themselves to do, so they didn't. They said, look, those people, well, we do acknowledge that they're there, but they're sort of to the side. All of us over here, we all come from England and Ireland and the place that Captain Cook was from and the colonials were from, and all of these people get to have citizenship because we've created a new land here. And all of those people, well, kind of still don't know what to do with them. So we're going to leave them to the right, say, for example. And so, I don't know whether you know very much about the Australian Constitution, but it was written up at Federation to create, some order, to create some sort of rules, legislation, well, the capacity to make legislation, just to make it so that everybody knew what everybody else was doing. And that's what the Constitution was, the rights of the people and so forth. And within the Constitution are people's right of citizenship. There's many different, sort of sections to it. But this particular section, Section 51, is the section of the Constitution that talks about the rights of citizenship. So the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, I'm reading it now, have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth. Okay, so they came over and they decided it was part of England, and so it was part of the Commonwealth, this, terra nullius that had nothing on it. And so it gave, the people here gave themselves the power to make laws. And so one of the powers that they had was that the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. So they make laws in regards to everybody here on this side, but they don't make laws in regards to the Aboriginals. And in reckoning the number of the people of the Commonwealth or of a state or part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. Did they do that in an act of separation? Did they think that it was respectful not to merge them all together? I don't know. It's something to think about, and I'm sure many people have written about it. But the fact is that they are not recognised within, or they were not recognised within the Constitution as being people who were also part of the Commonwealth, and therefore didn't have the right to vote. The initial conference of Commonwealth and State Aboriginal authorities in 1937 said this: this conference believes that the destiny of the natives of Aboriginal origin, and they write their set in context because they use the word natives, which is not appropriate, but not of the full blood, lies in their ultimate absorption by the people of the Commonwealth. Absorption by the people of the Commonwealth. And it therefore recommends that all efforts be directed to that end. So the policy of the Commonwealth is to do everything possible to convert the half-caste into a white citizen. So there you have it in black and white. The government of the time set a policy to really get rid of the Aboriginals, and that's, I guess, how they dealt with the Aboriginal problem. First of all, they came here and said, there's no one here. And then they said, well, there is someone here, we have to recognise it. But we're not going to really recognise them as people. You know, they're kind of part of the flora and fauna. And then they decided, well, killing them is not enough, or, you know, sort of destroying them and their culture is not enough. It's not working, perhaps. There's too many. I don't know what the thinking was around it, but certainly then they thought, well, you know what we'll do? We'll try and turn them white. We'll blend them. We'll bring them into our society, the little ones, and we'll mix them, you know, interbreed, if you like, till there's no Aboriginals left and everybody is just white. So, and may I just say that obviously this is very confronting now to read, but of the time, you know, we lived in a very different world. We lived in an extremely different world where racism and discrimination were typical of the day. They were typical, you know, they were typical frameworks. You know, people based a lot of their decisions and a lot of policies based on this division and segregation of the races. So they were really just typical. And therefore assimilation policies were introduced, and these policies presumed that Indigenous Australians could enjoy the same standard of living as white Australians if they adopted European customs and beliefs and were absorbed into white society. So now what we're talking about here is, well, the problem's too big. We want them to, you know, just become, you know, white, and that's called assimilation. And we now know through sociological research that assimilation is very difficult, to the point where we would say it doesn't work, because it means that someone has to give up something. It means that one part of that, you know, those two assimilating cultures has to be destroyed, has to be forgotten in order for, you know, just the one to exist. And we now know that that's very damaging psychologically. We know it's very damaging sociologically and culturally to just be rid of certain races in that way. But back then, that's what they did. So in 1961, rather than, you know, take the babies and try and make everybody white, they said, okay, you know, now let's just try and get everybody living together and make everybody, you know, one, whatever that is. And so here's the policy. The policy of assimilation means, in the view of all Australian governments, that all Aborigines and part Aborigines are expected eventually to attain the same manner of living as other Australians, and to live as members of a single Australian community, enjoying the same rights and privileges, accepting the same responsibilities, and observing the same customs, and influenced by the same beliefs, and influenced by the same beliefs, hopes and loyalties as other Australians. So, you know, so what they're basically saying is there's this thing called being Australian, and it looks like this, and it's pretty white, and it pretty much comes from, you know, the Commonwealth sort of side of things, and you need to be like this in order to enjoy the same privileges as us. So you need to deny your customs, because it says right there, you know, what does it say? Yes, the same customs as this bunch called the Australians. Deny your customs. You deny your own beliefs, because it says you need to be influenced by the same beliefs, and have the same hopes and loyalties. So basically, we want to wipe away your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanderness, and we want to paint it all white. And if we do that and we're assimilated, then, you know, you're going to be right. So can you see, I just want to pause and ask you, can you see how this culture has been thrown from pillar to post? Never, well, not even, well, not never, but we'll get to the current state, but even up until 1961, which is not that long ago, they were not recognised and acknowledged as a culture that needed to be preserved and kept intact and looked to for guidance about this country. No, you're a problem. You need to be dealt with. How are we going to do it? That seems to have been the message for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders all the way. And so it seems fairly obvious then, doesn't it, why, people of this nation, the original people of this nation, are so lacking in trust, in regards to governments. Look at what governments did to them and their families over the years. So the assimilation policy prevented Indigenous people from raising their own children, freely moving, accessing education, receiving award wages, marrying without permission, accessing public places, and also prevented them from the right to vote. Now look, I'm not saying that this is a one-off in the world. This sort of thing has happened in many parts of the world, and maybe even in your country as well. But what I am kind of saying is that this is not something that's discussed a lot here in Australia. And so you, as people from other countries coming into Australia, need to recognise the realities and also the history that maybe a lot of people from here don't even know. And so, this is. I'm not saying it's never been heard of in other parts of the world, but it certainly did happen here, and many people are in denial about it, and now it's being revealed, or you can access it. You can access this information. So almost every Indigenous family has been affected by the forcible removal of one or more children across generations. And so if you remember that idea early on, where they were, it was all about making everybody white, okay, and so eventually breeding the Indigenous people out. Well, the way that was done was to take their children from them. And so we have a situation in which, as it says here, the forcible removal of one or more children came about, and that is called and referred to here, and we will refer to it as the stolen generation. But the reality is that there were many generations of stolen people, so it wasn't just one, if that's what that word alludes to. So many people, families and communities are still coming to terms with the trauma that this has caused. So imagine if one day you were at home with your parents and government officials came and took you away to live with strangers and told you that you had to learn to live, eat and speak and dress differently than you were used to. How might that experience continue to affect you throughout your life? Clearly that is a question that we all know the answer to. But I think the important point to make there is that it doesn't just affect you and your family now. It affects and has affected every generation since. And so this is a systemic, intergenerational problem that was put on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by the various governments. And so it sits squarely and wholly in their hands. I'm actually not going to play this video. It's quite long, but it's very, very good. I highly recommend that you watch it. And I'll play a little bit of this one here. It's about 6 minutes long. I might stop it.
Yeah, we're here at Mutijula, right beside Uluru, the home of my ancestors. And it was in that area there called Tempe Downs where I came out. And that's why the police were brought in. And that's how I was taken, at that time by a police officer into Alice Spring. As like so many kids who then now refer to as the stolen generation. But of course, bush living was bush. You totally took most of your things from the land you're on. We just lived on the land as people of the land.